Myra Hindley and Rose West are Britain's most notorious female serial killers. Between 1963 and 1965, Myra Hindley was involved in the murder of 5 children and teenagers. 3 decades later, Rose West was jailed for her part in the killing of 10 women and girls. They were the first 2 women in Britain to be given whole life sentences. What happened to Rose West and Myra Hindley in prison is an extraordinary and untold story.
You couldn't make this up. It was literally unbelievable.
In this film, I'll be investigating their special relationship.
I believe Rose and Myra did become lovers, and they became really, really close.
One serial killer to another.
I'll be speaking to former prisoners, former governors, and those who knew them best. I'll be exploring what drew them together.
They both murdered children, and they both tortured people. Their crimes were very similar.
And discover their true natures.
Rose West is a grandmother who cooks and sews and bakes and kills and rapes.
Myra did have that natural instinct to manipulate and get what she wanted.
But within their relationship, who wielded the power?
To a certain extent, I think Rose West was in awe of her.
And ultimately, does the women's behavior in prison shed any light on their lives as serial killers?
She was literally foaming at the mouth, like a rabid dog. It was a moment of clarity of, I could see you killing.
The story begins in 1995, in the days before Rose West and Myra Hindley met at Durham prison. Durham was a high-security Category A prison. One wing was home to the most dangerous women in Britain, IRA terrorists, gangsters and murderers. Known as H-wing to staff, but to inmates, it was known as Hell Wing. To try to understand the true characters of Rose West and Myra Hindley, I'll be speaking to their former fellow inmates.
My name is Linda Calvey, and I served 7 years for armed robbery, and I served 18 years for murder.
My name's Marisa Mariko. I was in prison for money laundering. I literally was born into a mafia family. My father was a big boss. So I ended up in Durham H-wing prison.
But in 1995, one inmate was notorious. Already 29 years into her life sentence, that prisoner was Myra Hindley. What was she like as a person? How did she strike you?
I didn't like Myra. I found her to be quite a sinister character. And I could have imagined her being in Hitler's gas chambers, throwing people in. She was that type of person.
Her appearance was quite gaunt, and she was a chain smoker. You went past the cell, the smell is musty, smoky. Her presence was very menacing.
In 1965, when Myra Hindley was arrested, she was 23 years old and the most hated woman in Britain. Over a 2-year period, she and boyfriend Ian Brady abducted and murdered 5 children and teenagers in the Manchester area.
The very first time I actually came face to face with Myra, I was in the laundry and she was singing, and I just saw red, and without thinking about it, I just walked in and slapped her around the face.
You slapped her?
Yes, I did. And she rubbed her face, and I said, "How dare you sing when you've killed those children?"
What was Hindley's temperament like?
In person, she was as menacing as what had been written about her. That wasn't just because it's in your mind, it's a feeling. She was creepy. Just creepy.
In 1995, Pearl Davison was on Durham's Board of Visitors. Every week, over a 10-year period, Pearl visited some of Britain's most dangerous women.
Myra Hindley was the, well, queen bee, for want of a better word, on the wing, until Rose West arrived.
In 1995, Rose West, Britain's most prolific female serial killer, began her life sentence at Durham Prison. The previous year, police discovered that between them, Rose West and her husband Fred had murdered 12 women and girls, including their daughter Heather and stepdaughter Charmaine. Rose West was convicted of taking part in 10 of the killings.
I was on the wing when Rose West arrived, and she came and stood beside me. And she was rocking backwards and forwards, quite violently, really, a violent rocking. And I said to her, "Oh, you've come home," meaning this is going to be your home for a very long time. And she said, yes.
But what happens when these two notorious serial killers actually meet?
Everybody in Durham had all been reading about this case, the Wests, and everybody knew that eventually she would turn up with us.
So there was this woman stood there and it was sort of, okay, you're the serial killer. Because she just didn't look like a serial killer.
She was this little fat dumpy woman with huge big glasses, and we were sort of all quite shocked when we saw her. She looked a real old sort of frumpy granny.
In a million years, I would never have picked Rose West as a serial killer. She was like the next lady at the supermarket checkout. She was almost looked like a librarian or something. But eventually, through time, in such confined space, everyone's personality comes out. You know, your mask does come off.
The fictional image of the serial killer as some wild maniac is very misleading. Most serial killers, like Rose West, are relatively banal, ordinary individuals, and that's actually how they're able to carry on getting away with it for so long.
Myra Hindley had been in prison for nearly 30 years when Rose West arrived at Durham. They met almost at once.
It must have been quite amazing to find that these two people could be in the same prison at the same time.
It was really weird that they suddenly became best friends. They were with each other all the time. They had their breakfast together. They'd sit and have their tea. There was this little table with a red and white check tablecloth that they used to sit at.
When did you observe that there was a developing friendship between Myra Hindley and Rose West?
It was a Sunday morning and I came up the stairs to the first floor and it looks down at the chapel. And just as I looked down, the door opened. It was really bright sunshine behind and these two figures came out. And I looked, and it was Myra and Rose chatting away like no care in the world. And the way they were talking, it was like they were best of friends.
Did you ever think to yourself, I wonder what was the source of this relationship?
Well, they both murdered children, and they both tortured people. Their crimes were very similar.
To be honest, I actually thought it was probably two evils together. I wasn't shocked.
Everybody went, God, what a weird combination. Those two have become thick as thieves.
Just how close these two killers were to become was yet to emerge.
Almost the first question about Myra Hindley and Rose West is what exactly may have drawn them together.
Women who kill are very, very rare indeed. Women who kill as a partnership, I think, are almost unique.
So what role did each play as part of a killing couple? Between 1963 and 1965, Myra Hindley and her boyfriend Ian Brady terrorized the residents of Manchester.
They would go out in a vehicle, a van or a car. Brady would indicate a potential victim. Hindley would pull over and attempt to lure the victim into the car. They would then take them up to Saddleworth Moor. Brady would take them out onto the moor and rape and kill them.
Myra told me that after the killings there was a payoff, which was the further bonding of that relationship with Brady. She was elated that she'd actually carried out the task for her lover. Myra said that after each of the killings, there was almost an unwritten contract that sex would take place. And Myra described it as a buzz. It was part of a celebration that increased the bond they felt as a couple.
When you have two people working together, they authenticate each other. They convince each other that what they're doing is right and acceptable.
At her trial, Myra Hindley protested her innocence, but some evidence linked her to the scene of one of the murders.
Leslie Ann Downey was at a fair and they persuaded her to get in the car and took her back to their house in Hattersley. Brady immediately took the little girl upstairs. Myra Hindley followed a few moments later.
Former prison governor Veronica Bird began her career as a prison officer at Holloway.
I was very much aware of the Moors murder case and followed it daily.
An audio tape recorded by Ian Brady gives an insight into exactly what happened to 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. The tape was played to a chilling silence in court.
Downey, don't undress me, will you? And there was a sound of a child screaming. Hindley, hush, hush, shut up, or I will forget myself and hit you one. I will hit you one. Will you stop it? Stop it. Shut up. Downey, please take your hands off me. A minute. Please, Mum, please. I cannot breathe. Please, God. Why? What are you going to do with me? I want to see my mummy. Horrendous, isn't it? Poor little girl.
Hindley claimed not to have murdered anyone and in court pleaded not guilty. In 1967, the year after Hindley and Brady were sentenced, Fred West committed his first known murder, 140 miles away in Gloucestershire. His wife, Rose, soon joined him in a killing spree that lasted 2 decades. In February 1994, the police began to excavate the back garden of the West's home at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester. They found the remains of 9 girls and young women. Rose West was ultimately charged with 10 murders, including that of her teenage daughter, Heather, and her 8-year-old stepdaughter, Charmaine.
Rose West pleaded not guilty to all counts on the indictment.
After Fred West hanged himself in prison, Rose West was left to stand trial alone for 10 murders. I was in court every day and we heard horrendous forensic evidence that the West victims were bound and gagged and probably tortured. When the police recovered the victims, they found that many body parts were missing.
Evidence of abuse at the hands of Rose West came from her stepdaughter Anne-Marie, who made 21 statements to police.
Anne-Marie had been sexually abused, bound, taped, and beaten and raped from the age of 8 years old. She described graphically being bundled down into the basement and put onto a frame, and she was taped to it with binding tape. And then she was continually abused by Fred. Rose knew what was going on. She was present and assisted. And a few years later, Rose was offering Anne-Marie for sex to a number of men who lived in Gloucester. I mean, it's staggering. It's beyond belief, really.
For Rose West, the murders evolved out of bizarre, sadistic sexual activity. Fred and Rose West actually got sexual excitement out of the pain they created and out of the killing.
An essential part of the story of Myra Hindley and Rose West is that they were both attracted to sexual psychopaths. But could that have been because of what happened to them in their childhood?
Born in 1942, Myra Hindley grew up in Gorton, a working-class district of Greater Manchester.
Myra's father was a guy called Bob Hindley, and by all accounts, he was a violent man, an alcoholic, and made life very difficult in the home environment.
She didn't bond with him at all. He was somebody who was dirty most of the time. He worked as a labourer, so she got to not like men with dirty fingernails. The reason that Brady became so powerful so quickly in her life was because she'd already decided the sort of person she wanted to meet had to be clean-cut, intelligent, well-dressed. She mentioned his well-manicured nails, which were very important to her. She wanted him probably more than he wanted her in the early stages.
Brady presented himself as this sort of intellectual, a free thinker, and he was going to be different from everybody else because he was going to do what he wanted to do. It possibly made Hindley feel that she was something significant when she listened to him.
Myra Hindley was attracted to a man who would go on to become one of Britain's most infamous serial killers. But what of Rose West? In the early 1960s, when West was around 10 years old, her family moved to a village in Gloucestershire, Bishop's Cleeve.
Rose West came from a far more dysfunctional background than Myra Hindley. She was the product of two mentally ill people. Her father, Bill, was a diagnosed schizophrenic.
Rose West had a dreadful childhood. Rose West's mother, Daisy Letts, really was quite a meek and mild little woman. From an early stage in the marriage, Bill Letts was beating and abusing Daisy Letts, both physically and profoundly in an emotional way, to the point where she very soon became a nervous wreck. During the pregnancy, right up to the point where Rose was born, Daisy Letts was having electroconvulsive therapy to deal with her anxiety and depression.
I interviewed Rose's mum at the time of the murders, and she told me Rose would rock herself in her cot so violently that the cot would move across the floor. And I understand that Rose still rocks herself manically in prison to this day.
Rose West was groomed by her father, who was a vicious little psychopath and very seriously sexually abused.
Rose was the only one of 7 siblings in the family who wasn't beaten up by her father.
She was Daddy's girl, dozy Rosie. She'd sit on his knee. And it went on even after she was married to Fred West, because Bill Letts would be invited round to Cromwell Street by Fred West and would have sex with Rose West there. I think that sex was really a currency for her. It had made her survive as daddy's girl. She accepted the transactional value of sex in order that daddy didn't beat her the way he beat the other siblings. And I think that was probably the situation with Fred.
Fred West came from a highly sexualized environment. Rose was abused sexually from very early on. So when they came together, it just created a poisonous cocktail.
During her marriage, Rose West worked as a prostitute. But men were not her preferred choice of partner.
I discussed Rose's sexuality with her. And she said she preferred the softness and sensuality of being with women rather than the roughness of men. The only time she's admitted to enjoying sex was with women.
There are two aspects of Rose West's sexuality. One was that she was highly sex and needed a lot of sexual gratification. The other is that she was willing to use sex for controlling and manipulating others. And it's very likely that if the opportunity arose in prison for either of those, she would do it.
There is evidence from a number of sources that Rose has had a number of lesbian relationships whilst in prison.
Marissa Merico had her own personal experience of West's sexual advances.
Rose had a lot of baths, and it was very rare she'd be in the showers. Someone was in, and I went in, came out, and she'd come out before me. It was Rose West. And she was stood there drying herself with a towel, stark naked. And I just remember feeling shocked because obviously there's no privacy, you know, you're sharing showers. But when you come out, you sort of tend to have a towel around you and, you know, you're drying yourself. And she just, she was like this and staring.
Did she ever say anything to you?
No. For all I know, she could have had a crush on me. But it makes me cringe just the thought of that.
Myra Hindley's prison records revealed that she had a number of what they often phrase as close relationships. These relationships were thought to be physical in nature. You could say that she was promiscuous.
Marissa Merico also had personal experience of Myra Hindley's intimidating behavior.
I remember she was walking on the landing in front of me once, and it was the first floor, that's where her cell was. And she was walking that way, and I was that way, and I remember she just looked me up and down, like the same sort of concept of a guy looking at you when you go in a pub. She looked me up and down, and that made me really uncomfortable.
But both women had their eyes on a different prize.
I believe Myra Hindley and Rose West were lovers. Rose West said to me that she wanted to see how it goes. Yeah, me and Myra get along well.
But just how well these women were to get on was yet to be seen. At Durham Prison in the winter of 1995, Myra Hindley and Rose West developed a relationship that went beyond mere friendship. But what was it that drew these women together?
When I went to visit Rose West, she was very impressed with Myra Hindley, quite effusive. She told me about how Myra Hindley was very intelligent and had studied with the Open University. And to a certain extent, I think Rose West was in awe of her. Myra Hindley was clearly someone who stood out as being special.
Because the prisoners were all Category A, many of the cells were open, and both Hindley and West were able to circulate freely.
They used to go in each other's cells, and they became really, really close. I think the majority of the wing all thought that there was an affair of sorts going on between them.
There was like other times, like by the washing machine. They'd meet up there and be sort of chatting, doing the washing, and that wasn't a coincidence.
Early on, West would have looked to Hindley for help. So she was using sex to get what she wanted. Hindley would have been aware of that, and potentially she could use West to her own advantage.
If Myra Hindley appeared to be the more intelligent and charismatic character, then what of her lover's personality? How did Rose spend her time in prison?
She would cook meals. She was a really good seamstress. And she was really, really good with her hands at making stuff.
Capable of a lot of domestic accomplishments?
Yes. It just didn't go with the rest of her that you read about and the House of Horrors and whatever, and there's this woman baking cakes.
In talking about Rose West's temperament, did you ever see her get angry?
Yes. The newspapers had written something about her and had said things, and she didn't like it, and she was literally foaming at the mouth and effing and blinding and swearing, and it was way beyond. It was like a rabid dog almost. It was a moment of clarity of, I could see you killing.
She would burst out aggressively if her self-esteem was challenged or she felt frustrated in some way. And that's likely to reveal what was happening when she was involved in the murders.
Rose West couldn't keep her motherly mask in place. Before long, her outbursts became a regular occurrence, attracting attention from inmates, which had consequences.
There was about 3 arsonists on the wing.
There were arsonists on the wing?
Yes. There'd been a sort of spate of 3-4 different cells being set on fire.
One particular young woman picked on Rose for a fight and threw some lit material into Rose's cell and set fire to some of her stuff.
And her budgerigar was left in. So they brought the budgie out and it was all sooty and black. Well, Rose was absolutely hysterical about her budgie and said, how could anybody be so evil to light a fire and leave a budgie in a room?
How did she show that anger?
Suddenly you saw this switch to this absolutely raging creature, like a demon. And she was foaming at the mouth. She was so enraged. Nobody should hurt an animal. But they can murder a child without blinking their eyes and yet get hysterical over animals. I don't know, how do their brains work?
Throughout Rose West's life sentence, her temper rages created friction with inmates. Julie McAllister, jailed on a firearms offence, served time with West in Low Newton Prison.
I was in the dining hall and Rosemary West came in and she asked to sit at my table. And I said, no, you can't. And she actually spat on us. And she was standing in the queue talking to the prison officers about how she'd cooked them cakes again. And I've tapped her on the shoulder and I've punched her straight in the face. Caught her in the eye because you could hear the thud when she's hit the floor. I knocked Rose West clean out and I'm shouting, I'll do it again because I'm a mother. And the full dining hall ended up on the tables giving us a round of applause.
So if Rose West had a short fuse and lost control easily, it appears that Myra Hindley thought it was crucial to be in control.
I think Myra did have that natural instinct to manipulate and get what she wanted. And she succeeded 99 times in 100.
She's described as an arch manipulator. And it says she often appears to be a scheming woman, building up contacts with anyone she thinks has influence. The authorities wanted to protect the people that she could potentially manipulate.
In 1970, just 4 years into Hindley's sentence, she wrote to penal reformer Lord Longford and appealed for his support in getting her released.
The truth of the matter is, I am obsessed with an inordinate desire to be free. In other words, I have rampant gate fever. Her whole sentence was marked by a struggle to find a way to be free.
But it was in 1973 that Myra Hindley's manipulation reached its peak when she enlisted prison officer Pat Cairns in her bid for freedom.
Patricia Cairns was a former nun who became a prison officer at Holloway Prison. And Cairns basically becomes infatuated with Myra Hindley, and she falls deeply in love with her, and Hindley starts having a relationship with Cairns. I'll probably never forget the day that I happened upon the files. You couldn't make this up. It was literally unbelievable. They were making plans to fly out to Brazil so they could do missionary work. As part of their escape plan, they wanted to take some pictures of Hindley with the idea of getting a new passport and driving licence for her.
Pat Cairns smuggled in an Instamatic camera, and as an officer she had access to the key safe, and they took impressions of the key in a block of soap.
So Cairns smuggles the impressions out of the prison.
The keys are sent to an East London address where they're to be copied, but police are informed the package intercepted and traced back to Holloway Prison.
The case came to trial in 1974, and ultimately they're found guilty, so Cairns gets 6 years imprisonment.
It was a big shock that a prison officer could come down to such a low level. To plot for Myra Hindley to escape was just beyond belief. This is the power of Myra.
Myra Hindley attempted to manipulate everyone with whom she came into contact, and that included a prison officer. But was she able to control Rose West?
In 1996, at Durham Prison, inmates and prisoners say that cracks began to appear in the relationship between Myra Hindley and Rose West.
They became really, really close for about a month, 6 weeks, and as quick as they became really close, they parted.
When her friendship with Myra Hindley ended, did it just stop
It
altogether?
stopped, and they just weren't even speaking to each other.
The next time I visited, a couple of months later, things had turned very sour between Rose and Myra Hindley.
I spoke to Myra and I said, it was really weird that you were really close with Rose, then you suddenly parted. And she said, yeah, well, I thought about it and I thought, she killed her own children. Do I really want to mix with somebody like that? And I said to her, but you killed children. And she went, yeah, but they wasn't mine, they was other people's. And said it just matter-of-factly, as if, well, it didn't matter. But then that was Myra. Myra didn't have any remorse about anything.
Rose said, you've got to watch that one. She's very manipulative. She's dangerous, that one. I want nothing to do with her. Not going to let her take me for a again. I think clearly that demonstrated a deep sense of hurt, that somehow she'd been caught out by Myra Hindley, that somehow she'd given more than she wanted to Myra Hindley, and it had somehow cost her.
I think what's most likely is that Rose West realised that Hindley was playing with her, was trying to draw her out and control her. Having realised what was going on, she didn't want any more of it because she thought this would lead her into trouble or reduce her own control.
The prison files reveal just how cruel Myra Hindley could be when she controlled people.
The word manipulator comes up quite a lot in the documents, in particular her yearly reports. I found a report from the 1980s of someone who had 15 years experience of her that says that they'd never seen this in any other prisoner. And although that they didn't see her killing again, there are more ways to destroy a human being than killing them.
It's not easy to imagine a relationship between two such unlikely people. Hindley was intent on controlling others. West couldn't control her temper. Does this give an insight into how both women would deal with their criminal history after decades behind bars?
At the time of their trial, Myra Hindley and Rose West both denied their crimes. But after 20 years, Myra Hindley decided to break her silence, and she talked about the active role she played in the Moors murders.
By 1986, Myra Hindley was at Cookham Wood near Rochester in Kent, her third high-security prison.
In 1986, I was a detective inspector in the Serious Crime Squad in Greater Manchester Police. People who'd interviewed Brady believed that Brady was really teetering on the edge of confessing.
Brady's threatening to go to the press and tell everything, so she has to put her side of the story.
Not only that, 4 years later, Hindley's case for parole was due to be reviewed.
What Hindley probably thought is that it would give her a more sympathetic hearing and that it might contribute to the parole board making a recommendation for some limited form of release.
Hindley decided to confess first to her therapist.
What did she say about the crimes?
She was always deeply remorseful. And eventually she said, I need to say what happened. I need to go on the record. And I should have started talking about this 20 years ago.
The confession was a major ordeal for her. There's no two ways about that. But she was particularly disturbed and upset and crying when it came to talking about Pauline Reed. And also, in the case of Leslie Ann Downey, she was visibly upset and crying.
She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't blame Brady when she was totally under Brady's thumb. And she did what he said.
But you would agree, wouldn't you, that there are some sections of society which would find that story of seduction into doing evil things a little too glib?
I can understand that's a possible interpretation.
What was it that she said to you that made you so convinced of the, shall we call it, the seduction story?
I wish it had never happened.
But that's not good enough.
Well, what would you expect her to say? She was deeply aware of the pain and anguish, really. And she didn't sit and scream and blame anybody else. She took responsibility herself. Never, and not one occasion, did she seek to shift the blame.
On balance, it was carefully orchestrated as a confession, that is for sure. She made a point of saying, I was never actually there when the murders occurred.
It's her version of the story. That version presents her in the best light possible.
Hindley agreed to help police in locating the remains of the last two undiscovered victims, Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. A year later, police finally uncovered the body parts of Pauline Reed.
We found a white shoe, and then just a few more movements of the trowel, and you could see that there was a foot still inside the shoe.
Keith Bennett's remains have never been found. If Myra Hindley's objective in confessing was to be given parole, it didn't work. Parole was denied, and she spent the rest of her life in prison. Myra Hindley died in 2002. She was 60 years old.
What was her end like?
She was a very ill person. She was suffering. She was really suffering a lot. And I then thought, well, it's poetic justice. I didn't feel sorry for her. Nothing at all.
Myra Hindley did eventually face up to her guilt, although, as is frequently supposed, it had something to do with her determination to be set free. But did Rose West ever admit her involvement in the murder of 10 women and girls?
Early into Rose West's sentence, she saw a psychologist at Durham Prison. During the process, she lost contact with her children.
I suspect the children probably turned their back on her, and then she decided that she couldn't be a mother to them.
In 2001, Leo Goatley lodged an appeal on behalf of his client. But shortly afterwards, Rose West responded with new instructions.
She said, look, I don't want to proceed with this. So I said to Rose, well, what are you telling me? Are you admitting that you committed all these murders? And she said, no, I accept I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison.
It seems to me to be part of a process of her trying to convince herself that it never happened.
3 years later, Leo Goatley stopped representing Rose West.
Rose didn't tell me the truth, or she was selective with the truth. She hasn't admitted the culpability for any murder. I think that it's impossible for her to confront the enormity of these offences. It's better than facing the devil. She would rather live in this comfort and delusion.
People who are sexually abused as children often learn to cope with that by turning themselves off. I think that Rose rediscovered that in prison, and that gave her a mechanism to cope with the potential horror of coming to terms with what she'd done in the past.
By 2016, Rose West was 62 years old and detained at Low Newton Prison in County Durham.
I shouldn't have to share my dining table or my workplace with anybody who kills or rapes or hurts children when I'm a mother myself.
As a high-profile Category A inmate, Rose West was guarded and separated from the general prison population.
Rosemary West has a lovely wing. She has an ensuite bathroom. It's like the Premier Inn. Where I was held, I have to have a wee or a poo in front of your pad mate. And no privacy. Just the way that she was getting special treatment really pissed us off.
Rose has one friend left in the world. This is an elderly, religious prison visitor whom she knows as Mum.
Rose West speaks to Mum 3 times a week and has done so for the last 23 years.
This lady obviously believed she was innocent. I think she was one of the very few.
They both watch a lot of TV. Rose is an avid watcher of Strictly Come Dancing, and Mum votes for her. And last year, in fact, Rose voted for the winner, Kelvin Fletcher, an actor from Emmerdale. Mum says that Rose knows she will die in prison, and she just wants to be left alone to live out her life sentence in peace.
Rose West might well want peace, but her silence will always torment the families of her victims. Not only that, but there are thought to be even more families who've lost loved ones to Fred and Rose West.
I'm sure there were many more victims based on what experts have extrapolated from the time frame between killings. It could, on a conservative estimate, be another 20.
Rose West's refusal to face up to what she has done is probably preventing her from committing suicide.
Both women's prison years reveal a great deal about their real personalities.
Myra Hindley has been described as a devious woman who denied her guilt for 20 years.
What you find in her prison files is a woman who uses the system to get what she wants. So the idea that she was a follower of Brady doesn't seem to match the rest of her life.
She manipulated everyone she met, including Rose West.
The way things are at the moment, Rose West will take her secrets with her to the grave.
Rose West's time behind bars exposes a woman with an uncontrollable and violent temper. But above all, she was unwilling to face up to what she'd done.